As a seven-figure dividend growth investor that currently earns north of $6,000 in dividends on a monthly basis, I'm always on the search for the perfect dividend growth ETF that I can buy and hold forever. Now, I made a quick little list right here for some of the things I'd look for in regards to what the perfect dividend growth ETF would be if it exists, of course. Now, the perfect dividend growth ETF would have to have all these things, not just a few of them. It would have to have every single one of these things on the list in order for me to consider it to be the perfect dividend growth ETF. Now, this ETF is going to have for one, a positive price return long term, because even though as dividend investors we're searching for cash flow that grows over time, we also want our assets to get bigger and bigger as time goes on. Next is dividend growth ETF is going to have to be heavily diversified, because again, for an asset that you want to buy and hold forever potentially, diversification is going to be key and is going to help you sleep well at night. Now, this perfect dividend growth ETF is also going to need to have a super solid top 10 holdings. I'm talking 10 stocks that you'd be happy to hold on to for not 1, 5, but 10 plus years even. This ETF is also going to have a decent starting dividend yield, no 0.5 or 0.7%. We need a little bit more cash flow from day one. Then my favorite metric, this dividend growth ETF is also going to need to have dividend growth, a history of a dividend that's getting bigger and bigger as time goes on. Now, if an ETF has all these things, then as a bonus, I also add it could even pay out a dividend monthly, because of course a quarterly paid dividend is not bad by any means, but a monthly paid dividend long term, when some of us want to retire and use some of these dividends to pay for bills and things, it's going to just help keep our cash flow on a consistent basis a lot more neat. Now, I do have good news for you. I did find a dividend growth ETF that crosses off every single one of my qualifications when it comes to finding that perfect dividend growth ETF. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about which ETF this is, stick around, drop a like down below, and let's get right into it. I just finished my brand new dividend investing ebook where I share exactly how I went from zero to now over 7 figures invested, and also on how I earn more than $6,000 per month in dividends. I also finished my custom dividend tracker that you can use to track your dividend income progress on an ongoing basis. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. Now, the perfect dividend growth ETF that crosses off every single thing on my list is DGRW, or the Wisdom Tree US Quality Dividend Growth Fund. Now, it says right here in the Wisdom Tree website, Wisdom Tree US Quality Dividend Growth Fund seeks to track the investment results of dividend paying large cap companies with growth characteristics in the US equity markets. Now, I know I had a lot of qualifications on my list, but I'm going to show you that DGRW has every single one of those crossed off and more. So first off, we talked about positive price performance long term, because again, even though us as dividend investors, we definitely favor income and of course cash flow, but like I mentioned, we also want our assets to be going up and up and up over time. And DGRW has done exactly that, considering just around 10 or 11 years ago, this ETF was trading around $24 per share, and now it's trading above $71. That's up around 190% just as far as price return, and that's just over the last 11 or so years. Next, a very important aspect, especially for a buy and hold forever style long-term dividend growth ETF, would have to be the holding breakdown. Now, we talked about diversification and top 10 holdings. DGRW has around 300 different holdings, which is heavily diversified. Now, the reason I like that is because even if 1, 2, 3, or 5 different stocks within the entire ETF have a bad year, bad quarter, again, long term, being that diversified, as long as the major players in the ETF perform well, the ETF is most likely going to continue to flourish. Now, the holding breakdown for this ETF is very favorable for dividend investors that, of course, want some growth exposure. With technology being the number one sector, that of course is going to give you that growth exposure, a little bit higher beta, but it's not necessarily too much of the fun, which I love. Healthcare is also great. We also have industrials, financials, consumer defensive, and consumer cyclical making up the rest of the majority of the ETF. Now, top 10 holdings is something very important to me because, again, if you are going to invest a substantial amount of money into an ETF, and this is for any ETF for that matter, you're going to want to look at the top 10, top 20, top 30 holdings, and at least have an idea of what companies are in the top, and ask yourself, would I be okay with buying these companies on their own? And if not, of course, dig a little bit deeper into that. But with DGRW, the top 10 holdings make up of around 37% of the entire ETFs. So you are getting a lot of exposure when it comes to just these top 10 names. But names like Microsoft is definitely a stock that I definitely have held on its own, and Microsoft is 8% plus of this entire ETF. So this ETF is very exposed to Microsoft and Apple, for example, which I absolutely love, considering I'm very bullish on both of these. The ETF is also made up of a large portion of AbbVie, we have Broadcom, Johnson & Johnson, of course, Procter & Gamble, the Home Depot, Coca-Cola, Nvidia, Pepsi, and others. Now, even if I were to be brutally honest, these are all for the most part names as a dividend growth investor that I would not mind having as a single standing stock on my portfolio, but honestly I love the fact that you get some diversified exposure into these and more by investing into DGRW. So now that the price return checks off when it comes to DGRW, we talked about the diversification and the top holdings and even the top sectors, it's now time to look a little bit deeper into DGRW's dividend growth, dividend safety, etc. So DGRW does currently offer a trailing 12-month dividend yield of around 1.7%. Now I said that in my qualifications for finding the perfect, quote-unquote perfect dividend growth ETF, that ETF would have to have a decent starting dividend yield, and what I meant by that is I don't want to invest into something that has a 0.3% or a 0.5% starting dividend yield. And even though it's not an ETF, I'll give you an example. I'm talking about something like Apple that currently offers a 0.52%. Now I get it, you're not buying Apple stock to become a millionaire off the dividend, you're buying Apple, of course, for growth. But in the context of finding a dividend growth ETF that you're going to hold long term and get rich, hopefully not only the price performance, price return, but also off the cash flow that's paid to you consistently. 1.7% in my book is pretty decent as a start. But the other metric that's very important to me, very, very important, is dividend growth rate. Now, dividend growth rate is basically how much in dividends a dividend stock or ETF pays you year over year. Now, as you can see, DGRW for the most part has had some very significant, pretty positive dividend growth rates. Although there has been years where the dividends have dipped down a little bit, but then from there they've always went up. And this sort of wonky dividend growth is partially due to the fact that DGRW does pay dividends on a monthly basis. But even though DGRW does pay dividend monthly, they pay a different frequency where there's going to be a small dividend, a larger one. And as you can see right here, it's sort of sporadic. But even with the sort of sporadic nature of the dividend paid from DGRW, you can see that on a monthly basis. Hint, I said monthly basis. The dividends have been getting bigger and bigger over time pretty consistently. Now that brings me into my bonus qualification. I did say earlier that if said perfect dividend growth ETF also paid out a dividend on a monthly basis, that would be a bonus because of course if you're anything like me and you are a dividend growth investor that at some time in the future wants to use at least partial if not all of your dividend income to pay for bills, pay for travel, pay for whatever it might be, a dividend that's paid on a monthly basis is going to be much more convenient than that of a quarterly basis, and that's just because most bills are due on a monthly basis. Now with that, DGRW does pay a dividend on a monthly basis and has consistently since the inception of the ETF. Now just to play devil's advocate, I would say that because dividend income is sort of all over the place and you're not really going to get a consistent, steady dividend payment on a monthly basis when it comes to DGRW, that is I guess sort of a negative in the context of you wanting to retire and have the dividend income pay you consistently to cover your bills, etc. Now lastly, I thought it'd be kind of fun to compare DGRW to some of the other super high quality dividend growth ETF or indexes, of course, and showcase the total return or how much price return plus dividends included. Each of these have returned over multiple different time frames. Now just a side note here, VIG, SCHD, DGRO, S&P 500, and DGRW. In my opinion, these are all more or less good options for a long-term investor, at least in my opinion that is. But on the 1 year time frame, DGRW, for example, has a total return of almost 16%, S&P 20%, DGRO 9%, SCHD 2%, and VIG 12%. So DGRW, at least in that time frame, is towards the higher end. On the 3 year time frame, DGRW has a total return of 40%, S&P 27, DGRO 28, SCHD 29, and VIG 30. So in the 3 year time frame, DGRW has crushed pretty much all the other competition, although on a 3 year time frame, these have all done pretty well. But when it comes to the number one best of all time dividend growth ETF, I want to hear from you guys down below. Which dividend growth ETF do you think is number one? Drop the ticker symbol in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like on it and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.